Hi, back again for Mountains of Spices, and we will be doing chapter 15 entitled Pride and Superiority. But before I got busy reading, I thought I would give a big shout out to the Wednesday Night Girls Club by my friend Dee on YouTube. So, hi everybody! I hope you're enjoying these, and especially Hind's Feet on High Places. I'm hoping that you will get a lot out of that one and then continue on with me in Mountains of Spices. So, here we go. Chapter 15, Pride and Superiority. Pride had limped ever since that eventful day when he tried to overpower Much Afraid on her way to the high places, and the shepherd had come to her defense and had hurled him over the cliffs into the sea. Yes, he still limped, and his handsome face was very much scarred, and this was a very sore blow to him, for he had always been one of the handsomest and strongest men in the valley. Doubtless it was the fact that he could no longer arrogantly flirt with all the pretty girls, which had at last decided him to marry and settle down. He chose for his wife a relative of his, a wealthy young woman called Superiority, who had been waiting hopefully for several years for this event. She was by no means a beauty, but she was an heiress, and Pride had extravagant tastes far beyond the allowance which his father gave him. His wife brought him a fortune derived from investments in a company which had vast mining operations somewhere in the valley of the shadow of death. Lovely place, I'm sure. The mines were said to produce fabulous wealth, and the parents of Pride, Sir Arrogant and Lady Haughty, both drew their income from the same source. Strange as it may seem, the one special friend of Superiority's girlhood had been Much Afraid, the crippled, miserable orphan brought up in the home of Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. Much Afraid and her three cousins, Gloomy, Spiteful, and Craven Fear, had all been Superiority's companions at school. She had disliked the three Forebodings very much indeed, being jealous of Gloomy's striking good looks and of Spiteful's cleverness, and she had detested the bullying Craven. Perhaps it was the fact that they all three gave her a strong feeling of inferiority, whereas championing the trembling, ill-used Much Afraid gave her the soothing and comfortable sense of superiority her nature required, which was the real basis for this strange friendship. Much Afraid was not only ugly and crippled, but she was also stupid at her lessons, and Superiority had no need to fear being surpassed by her in any way. The other girls and boys in general disliked Superiority, for she had far more pocket money than anyone else, and prettier clothes, and was known to be an heiress. Therefore, Much Afraid's grateful and adoring homage had been balm and incense to her self-esteem, and had kept her from feeling friendless. Even when their school days ended and Much Afraid entered the service of the shepherd, the friendship had not really been broken. By that time, Superiority was already smarting inwardly from the constant neglect of Pride and his slowness in proposing to her, despite the fact that his parents had chosen to consider the two engaged since their school days. During his many flirtations with other girls, it had soothed her wounded feelings to continue to stand up for Much Afraid, and to insist that it was her horrible relatives who had driven her into the shepherd's service, and that no one could blame her for wanting to escape from such a home as hers as soon as possible. Then, When she went off with the shepherd to the high places, the dallying Pride, still without making any proposal to Superiority, had gone off in order to try to force Much Afraid to return, and had himself returned, not only having failed to achieve his purpose, but now so crippled and scarred of face that he was at long last ready to do what she had so long awaited, to marry her. Superiority told herself, therefore, that her friendship and gracious companionship of Much Afraid had been properly rewarded. Of course, as the wife of Pride, she was not tactless enough to speak of her old friendship with the one through whom Pride had experienced such a fall, and there had been no need to do so during Much Afraid's absence from the valley. It had been more difficult, however, when she actually returned with a new name, no longer crippled and disfigured, and attended by 2 regal-looking handmaidens. Undoubtedly, this would have been enough to break the friendship at last, were it not for the fact that Grace and Glory herself had taken such loving pains to maintain it. She had immediately sought out her friend, had given herself no airs, and had been so affectionately interested in all her friend's concerns that Superiority had been quite disarmed. After all, she said to herself, she may be considerably better off than she was before, poor little soul. But my own position is unassailable. I have a husband, lovely children, a beautiful home, and an ample fortune, and my husband is heir to a title. Why should I grudge my friend an improvement in her own fortune? I shall certainly not parade the friendship before my husband, and Grace and Glory shows that she is tactful enough not to do so either. It is just as well, however, to keep in with the shepherd's friends, and not to make enemies unnecessarily, as poor Pride has already found to his cost. But Superiority had begun to find that to continue a friendship with Grace and Glory was not the simple and easy matter which she had at first supposed. Strange as it seemed, considering the great difference in their worldly positions, it was impossible not to feel a growing sense of inferiority and envy. Certainly Grace and Glory had no home of her own in the valley, no husband, no children, no position. But in spite of that, she did really seem to live like a queen, waited on hand and foot, apparently, by her 2 regal attendants, every possible want somehow or other supplied, and enjoying complete liberty and independence. More extraordinary still was the growing influence which she seemed to exert on others. There were her aunt and cousins, for instance, so mysteriously changed in their attitude toward her, as loving now as they had been hateful before. In addition, so many of her fearing relatives were now actually entering the service of the shepherd. The influence and power which her relationship with him seemed to give her and the way so many people in the valley were now entering his service was a bitter pill for Superiority to swallow, for it was the shepherd who had humbled her husband, and now he, who had been so long despised and ignored by the whole fearing clan, was accepted by them all as a kind of king. It was not only the family of Mrs. Dismal Forebodings. They were not rich and important people, even though they were related to Lord Fearing. There was Bitterness, for instance, actually giving up his prosperous hotel in order to follow the shepherd, and now Resentment had announced his intention of resigning as bank manager because the shepherd had infected him with scruples about the investments in the Dead Valley mines, by which so many of the bank clients were getting rich. There was self-pity, too, and his stupid little wife, helpless, actually working for the shepherd and apparently enjoying it. Furthermore, according to the valley gossip, a host of less prominent citizens were doing the same thing. Then, to top it all, Grace and Glory held a position of influence and authority among them which she herself, the wife of Pride and daughter-in-law of Sir Arrogant, had never possessed. There came a day when Superiority asked herself if it would not be better to end the friendship and to escape once for all from the growing sense of inferiority which every meeting with Grace and Glory and her friends increased in her. Should she give up her friend and so sever all connection with the shepherd and cut herself off from all news of his doings? Or should she continue the friendship and accept the fact that the one she had once patronized and championed had now surpassed her altogether? Strangely enough, Superiority actually decided on the latter course. She could hardly tell why, except that when it came to the point, she found she really loved Grace and Glory, as she had certainly never loved Much Afraid, and that she could not part with her friendship. As soon as she admitted that to herself, she realized also that deep down in her heart she not only envied Grace and Glory, but also yearned passionately to find what Grace and Glory had found and to know the shepherd himself. She could not bring herself to confess this to anyone, but she made a secret inner choice. She would not give up the friendship with the one who now caused her to feel inferior and of whom she was now envious. It was shortly after this decision that Superiority noticed a change in her husband. He was increasingly moody and silent and appeared to be weighed down by some burden, whether of anxiety or annoyance, she could not tell. He did not confide in her, tried to laugh off her anxious inquiries, and grew all the time more and more moody. One moment, please. Okay, I'm praying that this is right here. Okay, it was shortly after this decision that Superiority noticed a change in her husband. He was increasingly moody and silent and appeared to be weighed down by some burden. Whether of anxiety or annoyance, she could not tell. He did not confide in her, tried to laugh off her anxious inquiries, and grew all the time more and more moody. One morning, they entered the dining room for breakfast at an earlier hour than usual, for Pride had announced the evening before that he must visit the City of Destruction and make an early start in the morning. His cousin, Resentment, the retiring bank manager, had visited him that evening, and the two had been closeted together for some time. Superiority feared that the visit must be connected with some business trouble, for Pride had seemed so morose afterwards. She knew her husband's extravagant habits and wondered whether he had a big overdraft at the bank. But she knew that her own fortune was ample for all their needs, and that while it was still in her hands, she could curb his extravagance. So she felt no fear. The memory of her husband's dark mood the night before, however, was swept out of her mind by the news she had to tell him. News brought by the milkman on his early round. "Pride," said she excitedly as soon as he entered the room for breakfast, "do you know what happened last night? The milkman brought the news this morning. Mrs. Murmuring's hotel was burned to the ground. I understand nothing was saved at all. It seems that the new man, Sharp, whom she made her manager, when Bitterness gave up his share in the business in order to follow the shepherd, it seems this man must have been drinking in his own room on the ground floor, and somehow started the fire in that room. By the time the people upstairs were awakened, the whole ground floor was in flames, and they had no escape from the windows. And when the fire engines arrived, and the fire was completely out of control, and the whole premises ablaze." They were fortunate to escape with their lives. Everything else is gone. Everything. They say that Murmuring herself was badly burned about the face and arms while trying to rescue the children, and several other people were injured too. What a loss it will be! I sure hope the premises were insured. Her husband, who had been staring at her with a strange, stricken look on his face, now muttered, I happen to know the place is not insured. That means Murmuring has lost everything. That man Sharp had persuaded her to use all her savings to enlarge and repair the place and to make those big alterations. The business was prospering so well that Murmuring decided this was the time to do it, and she told me that she would not insure it until all the expensive improvements were finished. What's happened to the man Sharp? Nobody knows. He's completely disappeared. Whether he was burned and lies under the ruins or whether he escaped can't yet be known for sure, but they think it likely he escaped, for the safe in his room was open and, of course, empty. Murmuring used to let him deposit the money there each evening, and she banked it the following day. It really is extraordinary the way she trusted that man, considering what a shrewd woman she was in every other way. What about Bitterness's share of the money, Pride? I suppose she couldn't use her husband's savings for those extensions and alterations. I understand that he gave up all claim to the money made in the business, answered her husband in a low voice. He said he wouldn't touch a penny of it, and that it was money made by destroying men. So I imagine Murmuring had it all. It's complete ruin for them, said Superiority, commiseratingly, but with the easy superficial concern felt by those who have an assured fortune and cannot be faced by loss or ruin themselves. Her husband looked at her queerly. His face was very pale, and his hands were shaking. After a moment's pause, all he said was, What a good thing it is that Bitterness had already entered the shepherd's service. They will have a roof over their heads anyhow, and something to live on. The shepherd appears to provide for his helpers generously when they are in need. It's a pity Murmuring didn't agree with her husband and gave up the business when he did, and so escaped this complete loss. Giving a harsh, strange laugh, he added, In the end, fate and good fortune always seem to be on the side of the shepherd's followers, and bad luck with his enemies. His wife looked at him in astonishment. Never had she heard him speak in such a tone of voice or mention the shepherd in that way. Before she could say anything, the maid entered the room, carrying the morning paper which had just arrived, and with an odd, scared look on her face, she laid it beside her master's plate and left the room. Pride unfolded the paper. Huge black headlines stretched right across the front page. Then Superiority saw her husband turn ashy white. The paper fell from his nerveless hands, and he slumped forward over the table. She uttered a little cry of terror, rang the bell for help, and hurried to her husband's side. The paper had fallen to the floor, but she caught sight of the headlines. Greatest fraud of the century. Dead Valley Mines, a gigantic hoax. Complete collapse of all banks in the City of Destructions. All investments a dead loss. As her terrified eyes read these words, the self-assured heiress, who had felt herself inaccessible to the blows of fate, knew that ruin as complete as that which Murmuring had met during the night had overtaken them also. Which only too well she knew that every penny which she and her husband and his parents possessed came from investments in the same gigantic hoax. Everything they possessed was gone from them like a burst bubble. When Pride recovered consciousness, he was in a fearful state of mental fear and distress. For weeks he had been dreading this calamity that had now overtaken them, hoping against hope that the rumors of which resentment had brought word would prove untrue. Now the blow had fallen. Everything they possessed was gone, and he knew of no way in which he could earn a living to support his wife and family, and his equally penniless parents. He had never learned to work. He knew no trade or business. He was quite unfit from a lifetime of soft living for hard manual labor, and the awful realization broke over him that he was completely inadequate for this new and terrible situation, unable to face life as it now faced him. The thought of his wife and children left utterly alone and penniless withheld him from committing suicide at once. But the realization that he himself was unable to do anything for them, even if he remained with them, was so terrible that he felt he could not bear it. He had been suddenly stripped of everything in which he had trusted, and now found himself so despicably incompetent and inadequate that it seemed a disgrace to remain alive. His wife, Superiority, was equally terrified by the discovery of her own unfitness to face life and its demands when deprived of all the service and ease and pleasures with which wealth had supplied her. Her reactions, however, differed from those of her husband. Perhaps it was the inner decision which she had made a few days ago to continue to love Grace and Glory, because of the passionate longing in her heart, which she had at last admitted to herself, to know the shepherd, that made her, at this time when her whole life lay in ruins about her, think with a desperate, almost despairing hope of appealing to the shepherd for help. When at last her half-crazed husband could be brought to listen to her, and she made the suggestion that in their utter loss of all things they should at last turn to the one they had so long disdained and rejected, Pride's reaction was one of agonized horror and shame. "How can we?" he almost shrieked at his wife. "How can we go crawling and groveling to him now that we are ruined and absolutely destitute? How can we implore his help after scorning him all these years when we were wealthy and secure? We can at least save ourselves that last, complete humiliation of groveling before him as beggars, pleading for a pittance flung us out of pity and likely being despised and turned away." "But we are beggars," said Superiority in a trembling voice. "And is it not better to face the fact, Pride, and to acknowledge ourselves to be what we really are? Unless the shepherd will accept us and teach us some kind of useful work, however menial, I don't see what other hopes there is for us." Pride groaned in anguish. "There's nothing I can do. For weeks and weeks I've thought about it and sought for some course of action to follow should this overwhelming catastrophe come upon us. But there is no solution. Absolutely none. There is no way out but for me to die. Perhaps the shepherd would help you then, but he will have nothing to do with me, for I've been his worst enemy all these years." "Pride," said a quiet, commanding voice. "Pride, are you in Superiority willing to listen to me at last?" Looking up in the midst of their anguish and ruin, husband and wife then saw the shepherd himself standing in the room beside them. His face was stern, and his voice was stern, but there was a note of compassion and mercy in it also. Both trembled in his presence and sank down at his feet, bereft of strength, yet in the depths of their hearts both felt an indescribable sense of relief and comfort. "Pride and superiority," went on the quiet, commanding voice. "All your lives you have been exactly what your names suggest, proud and superior toward others. But wherein did your fancied superiority consist? In the fact that you possessed wealth and possessions and privileges which others did not? Never once would you look at yourselves as you really were. Now that the wealth and possessions which gave you this superior attitude have been taken from you, wherein lies your superiority? On what can you pride yourselves now? Are you ready at last to learn of me, who am meek and lowly in heart, and to find rest for your souls? For humility is simply to see yourselves as you really are, and meekness is to admit the truth about yourselves and to act accordingly." The two bowed their heads before him and were at first speechless. Then Pride muttered with almost a sob, "You are right, sir. It is all true. But how can I come to you now asking for your help after proudly rejecting you all these years?" "Are you still a fool, Pride?" asked the shepherd. "It was folly to reject me all the years when you possessed wealth and imagined that you could manage without me. Now that you know your utter helplessness, and that in yourself you possess nothing, cannot you see that it would be sheer madness to go on rejecting me? Oh, foolish man! Do you not realize that this world and this earthly life are so arranged that sooner or later every single human soul must realize that he is nothing, but is absolutely dependent upon me? If you would not learn this truth while you had temporal possessions, do you not see that there was only one thing love could do to make you understand the truth? Namely, take those possessions from you, leaving you naked and empty and stripped and exposed to the realization of your own true position? It is love, pride and superiority, love himself, who has brought this so-called ruin upon you. Is it ruin for love to topple over and cast down every false screen you had erected to hide the truth from yourselves? Love has but arranged it so that you must face the truth at last. See yourselves as you really are, not as you have painted yourselves in your own blind imagination. Are you therefore still going to continue to reject my help and grace on the ground that you now see how unworthy you are to seek it? Will you be a madman, Pride? Or will you humble yourself so that at last I may make you what I want you to be?" "Sir," said Pride tremblingly, "sir, forgive me if I ask it, but can you really do anything with one so utterly helpless and despicable as I am?" "I can make you what I planned that you should be when I created you. If you will be meek and lowly of heart and learn of me, I will teach you and show you how to use for my glory all the benefits and advantages and privileges which you have enjoyed. But you must be willing to begin at the very beginning with nothing at all, willing to take from my hand this loss of all on which you have counted in life, and to accept instead that which you have despised. A low position in poverty and meanness in the eyes of the world. You must learn a new standard of values, and to adapt your desires to that which I choose for you. It is a hard saying, Pride, but this is the truth which you have refused to face up to all your life. There was a silence in the room when he had finished speaking. The man who had for so long hated and resisted the Lord of love, who had first been crippled through his own resistance, then ruined through continuous resistance, and the woman who, like her husband, had refused to see herself as she really was, sat there in silence, debating whether they would accept the truth about themselves or reject it. Then Superiority rose, and going to her husband, took his hand and said in a trembling voice, "This is the great opportunity of our lives. We have been fools. Shall we cease to be fools from this day onward? We have lost all but our own selves. How blessed to lose ourselves also, that we may find the life we were meant to live. He says he will make us meek and lowly of heart like himself. I am sick to death of being superior. Are you not sick of being proud?" Then her husband rose to his feet too, and they went and knelt before the shepherd and said, "Sir, we are nothing. We are miserable beggars, unworthy to ask your aid, but we are your slaves from henceforth and forever." The shepherd said with infinite loving kindness and love, "My slaves, meekness and lowliness of heart, learn of me, and you shall find rest unto your souls. For my yoke is easy, and my burden is light." And that is the end of chapter 15. Until next time, may the Lord bless you and keep you. May he make his face to shine upon you and be gracious to you. May the Lord lift up his countenance upon you and grant you his shalom.